All right, here's one of the major questions that everybody has right now. Are we in the midst of an economic collapse? I'm not talking about a simple recession. We've experienced those over the last 30 years. No, I'm talking about something that we have not seen for 4 decades in this country. And the reason why you know it's probably going to happen is because politicians are flocking to social media, the news, and everyone else to try to get out their narrative with respect to who's to blame and what should be done. And lo and behold, there's a whole host of politicians that think everybody else is to blame and that the solution is for them to have more power. And so we're going to explain on this episode what is really going on, what has caused it. Because the bad news is this: there are some economic realities that we're going to have to face that are inevitable. But if we can properly understand why it happened and how you fix it, we can actually improve going forward. We're going to discuss all that and more on this episode of Making the Argument, where we make the arguments to defend a free society.
I think this is one you're going to want to stick around for, because if I'm right, you are going to walk away with actionable items that you can use to discuss with friends and family and use this to have a more appropriate and effective conversation. So thank you for joining us. And if you found this episode to be valuable, leave us a comment on the YouTube channel and make sure you leave us a review on Apple Podcasts.
All right, as always, I'm your host, Nick Freitas, member of the Virginia House of Delegates, but other than that, a good person. We also have my beautiful wife, who is not here today. Don't worry, she will be back, I think. It's not like she got up this morning and said, hey, I need to go out and get some milk, and then didn't come home. So I think she'll be here. I think she'll be here next episode. But yeah, so Tina, unfortunately, is not with us today, but we do have our resident historian and political prognosticator, Christian Hines.
Hello.
And I want to say, we always say political prognosticator. Mm-hmm. And a couple episodes ago, we actually got to go over some things where he got to prognosticate in the future. Now what we're going to do is validate all the credibility we have given this guy in telling you that he's someone you can trust, because we're going to go back in time and look at something that he wrote in order to tell you that, hey, he might know what he's talking about. Yeah. And then, of course, as always, we have our producer, the guy that makes it happen, Nicholas Hamilton, the good Hamilton, not the one that pushed for
that is exactly right, Nick.
Central bank.
Not the filthy monarchist.
Yeah.
It is a pleasure to be here with you all. And Christian, I vaguely remember about a year ago, you putting out a rather long essay. It was an essay on Facebook predicting what we would call the everything bubble. I'm hoping you can give us a bit of context into that prediction.
Yeah, without reading like the whole essay.
I won't read the whole essay. That would be the episode right then and there. That's a wrap, everyone. No, it was pretty long. But first off, thank you for the giant ego booster. I would not have said that myself. I think that I called to some degree what's happening with the implosion of the NASDAQ and the S&P 500, what I think is soon to be the implosion of the housing bubble as well. We haven't gotten to there yet, but don't worry, if the interest rates keep rising, we will. But in February last year, so February 2020, I was looking at the markets. They were on an all-time high, despite the fact that unemployment was through the roof. Inflation was about to go through the roof. It hadn't actually happened yet. In February 2020, inflation, I'm pretty sure, was under 3%. But I was looking at, how much money the Federal Reserve had injected into the economy and where it found its way into, and it found its way into stocks and real estate. And I put 2 and 2 together, and I thought, oh my God, we're in the largest economic bubble in history. I mean, at least in the history of the United States. And so I wrote 2 things. One thing I wrote on February 13th, which is really short. And I said, we're in the middle of probably the largest bubble in modern history. I can't tell you when it will end, but I can tell you how it will end, in tears. This is completely uncharted territory. I'm old enough to remember when it was the Federal Reserve's job to take away the punch bowl once the party started to get out of hand. And now they're actively spiking the punch. This was back when the Federal Reserve was continuously injecting trillions of dollars into the economy at the time. They had not slowed down the money printer, so to speak. And Nick actually replied to that Facebook post of mine and said, it's always been the Fed's job, but they don't typically do it. And he was referring to the Federal Reserve on paper is supposed to be keeping this stuff in check. But as history shows, ironically enough, it's actually usually the Federal Reserve that's causing these problems, not solving them or keeping them from happening. And then it was a few days later, on February 19th of 2021, that I ended up writing the essay. And as I said, I'm not going to read the whole entire thing because it'd be way too long, but I'll summarize it by saying that I started it with, today marks the 1-year anniversary of the beginning of the COVID crash of 2020, when the S&P 500 peaked before plummeting some 34% by March 23rd. And then I go on to write, since then, the market has recovered and reached an all-time high. And then I got into why I think that was the case and how I think that market recovery was really illusory. It was not because the economy was growing. The economy was shrinking during COVID because politicians had shut down large parts of the country. So why on earth was the stock market going through the roof at the same time that productivity was collapsing and everybody was locked inside their homes for a year? And so then, I gave my reasons for why, and we'll get into some of that today over the course of this podcast. But then I concluded with a prediction that was one that I didn't want to see happen, but I think it's starting to play out. And I finished this essay with saying that, we're in a giant bubble, and ironically, it's the M2 money supply, which we'll explain what that is in a little bit. But it's the M2 money supply which greatly helped to fuel this bubble. And that could actually very well prove to be its undoing. Should the massive increase in the M2 money supply lead to a spike in inflation and thus bring about higher interest rates, that would almost certainly cause the bubble to crash and tank large sectors of the market, which has relied on a steady supply of cheap credit and nigh unlimited liquidity to fuel its meteoric rise. We're seeing signs that this could already be taking shape. And then I go on to explain that, there were a few indications to suggest that inflation was about to start rising. And this was back, again, when inflation was way below, what it currently is. It was underneath 3% at the time. And then I concluded with, so how does this end, or when does this end? I didn't know. I wrote this in February last year, but I didn't know that it would take over, 12, 14 months later for it to actually start playing out. But now it is.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that as we looked at how we were going to discuss things on this podcast, one of the biggest things that we wanted to do was ensure that we were hitting on the narratives, because the left has an answer for what's really going on and what's really causing all of this, whether it's inflation, whether it's things like student loan debt, whether it's housing prices, whether it's general increase in prices. They have all got their responses. And so we're going to go through what Joe Biden, what Elizabeth Warren, what AOC, what Bernie, what are they chalking up the problems to? Because like I said, we are past the point of anyone pretending like this isn't happening.
Can I just point out 1 second before we actually jump headfirst into this? Because I think we're going to start with a tweet from Joe Biden here. That is a recent tweet, by the way.
Yesterday.
He deserves to be lambasted for. But I just want to point out, the same people on the left, the same politicians that are now trying to give you a solution to the problem, are also the same people that a year ago were telling you there was gonna be no problem.
Yeah.
I just want to get that across. Like, when I was writing this in February 2021, saying like there's gonna be a huge problem, I'm old enough to remember when Democrats and other politicians were trying to say that there is no inflation.
Oh, the experts, oh my gosh.
We couldn't see this coming. How on earth could the Federal Reserve not see this coming? And I could.
Well,
I'm not an expert.
Let's go because we're going to explain that. We're going to explain. Let's go into this. So the very first tweet that we've got to bring up, because inflation is one of the numbers. This is the first time in my lifetime that when Americans are polled on what is the issue you are most concerned about, they say inflation. Right? First time in my lifetime that has ever happened. So we've talked about inflation before on this podcast. We've provided definitions about what it is. But today what we want to talk about is, what is Joe Biden chalking it up to? And he sent out this tweet, which, by the way, has 98,000 likes. And he said, you want to bring down inflation? Let's make sure the wealthiest corporations pay their fair share. Now, one of the things that we try to do on this podcast, right? You've heard of a straw man argument. That's where you create like a weak version of your opponent's argument and then knock it down. We try to do what we call the steel man argument, which is to say we try to give it the best possible, interpretation possible, so we can then go through and analyze it.
Yeah, if we wanted to set up a straw man argument, we would have
come up with this. This is what we would have said. Like, he did it for it, and I'm sitting here going, this is about the closest thing you come to a non sequitur, right? You want to bring down inflation? The government needs to take more money from people. What? I mean, the whole reason why. Let's ask this question: why do corporations, and oh, by the way, everybody else why is there a lot more money in circulation right now? Was it because corporations went down to their basements and started cracking out, dollar bills based off of their printing presses? No, it was because the government started doing that. Like, if he wanted to come up with if he wanted to come up with a answer that would have been absolutely true, that would have like dinged Republicans, he would have come out and said, Federal Reserve printed trillions of dollars during the last administration. And you know what? That would have been accurate. But to come up with this, like, we're going to bring down inflation by taking more money out of the private sector, that is patently absurd, verifiably false.
What he's insinuating is that it's corporations that are causing the inflation. And I'm no fan of the Libertarian Party, but I'm reading this reply tweet from the Libertarian Party of Tennessee. And boy, do they hit the nail on the head right there. Among the wealthiest seems to be the Federal Reserve, which is the source of the inflation.
Yeah, well, and that's a good point, because we can sit here all day long and talk about this as a non sequitur argument. It's ridiculous. It assumes things that aren't true, because again, what is inflation? Inflation is a monetary phenomenon. What it is the government prints out more fiat currency. They print out more money, right? Or at least that's the current inflation that we're experiencing. And then the individual value of each unit of currency, right? Each dollar has less value because there's more of them that were put into circulation, not as a result of increased wealth and productivity, but just because the government did it, right? They printed more money to pay. And what's fascinating about this is that when they first print all this money, it's not like you experience inflation overnight. The first people to get access to the money, banks, Wall Street, et cetera, they're still getting pretty much parity with
the value of the money.
Yeah, their purchasing price. It's the longer it's as it goes into circulation and you have more transactions, then all of a sudden the market responds to, there's a lot more people competing for these scarce resources, and we don't have an increase in resources, and so the price of everything has to go up. And so the overall purchasing power of your dollar goes down. So that's what we mean by inflation as a monetary phenomenon. But here's what's so fascinating, because when Libertarian Party of Tennessee, and again, I would say that both of us, I have a great respect for a lot of libertarian philosophy.
Small L libertarian philosophy.
I consider myself to be a very liberty-leaning, conservative. But when he says among the wealthiest seems to be the Federal Reserve, I think a lot of people look and be like, what does that even mean? Like, what does the Federal Reserve actually have? Well, Christian,
let's take a look at their balance sheet.
Charts. So let's look at the balance sheet for the Federal Reserve.
So we pulled up
and explain what this. Explain what this means.
So this is the trick that politicians do. They take a subject that is incredibly important, that is also very complex and difficult to understand, and then they gaslight you into believing complete nonsense. It's not corporations that do this. It's not the evil, greedy, rich people. The source of this problem is the Federal Reserve, and we've got the charts to prove it. By the way, these resources, for those of you that are listening to this rather than watching this, what we're showing the audience here that's watching this is literally from the Federal Reserve's own websites. These aren't, they're not coming from us. They're not coming from, Reason Magazine. They're not coming from Cato Institute or Heritage. This is from the Federal Reserve. So here's what's called their balance sheet. This goes back to 2008. The Federal Reserve balance sheet is basically how much money do they have. When we say printing money, we don't necessarily just mean literally printing money. The Federal Reserve can create money electronically, and then they can go out into the market and they can buy assets. Usually it'll be like treasury bonds, or it could be corporate bonds. And when they purchase those things, that's called increasing the balance sheet. And so what happened before the 2008 crash was the Federal Reserve's balance sheet was about $900 billion. And if you go back here, you can see it right before the crash, it gets to about $900 billion. As you go forward through time, you can see the 2008 crash, it spikes up to $2 trillion. So what that is the Federal Reserve bought a bunch of assets to try to save the markets during the great crash in 2008. And then you had another round of what's called quantitative easing, which is basically, again, the Federal Reserve money printer running Burr and then them buying assets, that happened during the Janet Yellen era at the very tail end of the Obama presidency. You're looking at like 2014, 15, 16. But then it levels off. And you see that near the end of the Obama administration, the beginning of the Trump administration, under Jerome Powell, the Federal Reserve is no longer buying any more money. Now, their balance sheet's still massive. It's $4 trillion, but it leveled off. And then in late 2017 and then throughout 2018, the Federal Reserve started to sell off those assets. And so not only were they not running the money printer anymore, they were trying to deleverage themselves, which meant that they were trying to return back to what we were at before the 2008 crash, which is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And this, by the way, is where we are trying to point out that both sides are responsible for this, because we had a lot of Republicans, including Trump, I have to admit, that were mad that Jerome Powell was trying to deleverage, trying to raise interest rates in 2018, and admittedly trying to do the right thing. But it wasn't just Trump. It was many Republicans that did this. And Jerome Powell threw his hands up in the air and basically said, fine, I give up. And so you see this drop as he's trying to deleverage. This is the same time that he's raising interest rates, which are the two things that you needed to do in order to stop the bubble from forming, because there was already a bubble forming in 2018. And he stops at the end of 2018 after what's known as the Christmas crash. If you go back and you look at the stock market, you see this huge dip in December 2018, and that's this process happening. The market was freaking out. Jerome Powell throws his hands up in the air and says, I give up, and he stops. And then you see the money printer turns back on again a little bit. And then you had this thing that came out of China in December 2019, just over a year later, a little thing called COVID.
Yeah.
You might have heard of it. And lo and behold, the response from the Federal Reserve was something that we have never seen in the entire history of modern economics anywhere in the entire world, period. What happened was that the Federal Reserve's balance sheet went from $4.1 trillion on February 17th, 2020 to $7 trillion by May 25th, 2020. So you're looking at February to March, March to April, April to May. In 3 months, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet went from $4 trillion to $7 trillion. They injected $3 trillion into the economy in 3 months. That is more than the response to the 2008 crisis, where it went from $900 billion to $2 trillion. That's tremendously more. But it didn't stop there. The money printer kept going. It continued for the rest of 2021 into 2022. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet just went up and up and up and up and up until finally it got to $8.9 trillion, where it currently stands today. And now Jerome Powell is trying to deleverage. Well, good luck with that, buddy.
Yeah. And what's important for y'all to understand about this is that, again, as people, this illustrates the absurdity of this idea that the government just hasn't taxed corporations enough, because that would stop inflation. Like that, it literally has nothing to do with it.
So for the person at home
it.
that looks at this chart, that's watching or that's listening, though, they might see this chart. By the way, again, you can go to the Federal Reserve's, just Google Federal Reserve balance sheet and you can find this chart. If you look at this chart, though, you might think to yourself, okay, so what does this mean? I mean, so you're telling me that the Federal Reserve bought a whole bunch of stuff. They printed a whole bunch of money, went into the marketplace, bought a whole bunch of stuff. How does that cause inflation? So to show you the next chart that we've got, then this is a direct proof to it. The next chart that we're looking at, also from the Federal Reserve, is the average price of a home in the United States. It's actually the median price of a home in the United States. There's a difference, but this is going back to 2008. And if you look at 2020, by the way, the gray lines represent market crashes. So look at the average home in the United States, say at the beginning of 2020, like January, quarter one of 2020. The average home price in the United States at the beginning of 2020 was $329,000. Look at what happened after that. You see a dip where the COVID crash happens into quarter two, down to 322. And then look at what happens after that. It goes up and up and up and up and up and up and up until finally it's $428,000 for a median house in the United States. Now, if you want to go back to the previous balance sheet, gosh, doesn't there look like that there's a correlation?
It almost like there's a correlation between just printing trillions of dollars.
Why is it that at the exact moment that the Federal Reserve started to print $5 trillion in the span of 24 months, why is it that this spike right here is almost directly correlated with the spike in home prices? And there's proof of this, by the way, if you go to the third chart that we've got, which is the M2 money supply.
Now explain what M2 money supply is.
Nick actually gave a good explanation of this right before the show.
It's basically money with, so like M1 is cash. Like what money do you have? When you get into M2, now you're talking about assets that you have that are easily liquid.
Cash or cash equivalents.
Yeah, cash. So it's stuff that you can easily get out of your savings account or I think I think there's some money markets
like
or whatnot.
Bonds and stuff like that.
It's stuff that you can easily like sell right then and immediately use. So it's the amount of cash that is quickly available to be able to be used within the marketplace. So we're not talking about like a real estate asset that you would have to put on the market, sell, and then get money from. We're talking about something that I can call up the bank right now and be like, hey, liquefy this, and then I can go spend it. So when you've got that huge amount of money just flooding into the marketplace.
Yeah. This is basically very, very simple explanation. This is basically the amount of money that's in circulation, theoretically, that could be in circulation. And you see the same exact spike. see the little line, which is this is the March 2020 COVID crash right here, this little tiny gray line if you're looking at it. And you see the giant surge in the M2 money supply, directly correlated with the increase in home prices, directly correlated with the size of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. These are all correlations right here. Mm-hmm. And you can go back and you can look at the stock market. We didn't even show that, but if you pull up the S&P 500 and you pull up the NASDAQ, you see the exact same thing. You see a dip in March, and then you see just this upward march from March 2020 into April, May, June, the whole entire rest of the year of 2020, and then into 2021, all the way up until the point that I wrote my prediction on Facebook last February saying we're in a giant bubble.
Well, and like, so to round this one out with this whole inflation tweet, again, the narrative that you're starting to see from the left is that inflation, and they're kind of conflating inflation with just rising prices, right? Those two things correspond. They're not exactly the same thing. You can have rising prices without inflation. All right. If there is more demand for a particular good or service, but there's less supply on it, you're going to get higher prices without, the Fed printing more money, right? That can lead to high prices. What they're trying to input in your mind is that higher prices are somehow a result of something other than what they're doing through monetary policy. So this whole idea of if only the government, and what's so absurd about this particular tweet, and we're going to go into some other ones that other people have made that are wrong, but actually make more sense. When I say this is a non sequitur, what I mean is this is a non-starter. When he says that if only the government was taxing corporations more, it would reduce inflation. I can't even think of a more absurd equivalent. Like, what do you...
If only the government just took more money out of the private sector and then spent it themselves, that would lower inflation.
Yeah,
well, two things. It looks like the White House's social media team woke up and said, how can we get 100,000 likes on a tweet without even thinking about if it's true? And then two, they don't, does the Biden administration understand that you take more money away from corporations that they have to raise their prices?
It's one of two things.
Yeah.
Either they know better. Part of me thinks that they know better and they're being malicious and they're gaslighting people into believing something that is patently false. Or no, they're actually that stupid.
Well, and I generally have a rule, right? I don't chalk up to malfeasance that which can be attributed to stupidity. This is not stupidity. They know better. What this is when again, this goes back to that theme that we were talking about in the opening, right? When you know that something bad is coming economically, and you can't stop it because there's been so much bad policy that has fueled it that there's a certain degree of inertia, it starts being, who do we blame? And you can see right here in this tweet, the way they want people to look at this is corporations did this to us. And all I want people to understand here is, I don't care if you like corporations. I don't care if you don't like corporations. You can't blame them for inflation.
Oh, but what about billionaires?
Oh, okay, and which goes
what
right
about
into
the
our
evil,
next
greedy
segment.
rich people?
So let's go to AOC's "Billionaires are the Problem" tweet. So AOC tweets out this: the number of billionaires in the U.S. couldn't even fill an apartment building, but the number of people they negatively impact is only growing. All the U.S. billionaire votes combined couldn't even come in second for an NY City Council election. That's why they stay pressed. Whatever. But here's what I think is interesting about this. This is once again this idea, this posturing. And it's the idea that, well, billionaires are the problem because you see the number of people that they negatively impact is only growing. So why is this effective messaging? Well, first of all, it feeds on a human trait that we all deal with, envy, right? Greed and envy is something that all of us contend with.
Otherization as well.
Yes. So the idea is that obviously Alexandria Cortez is not a billionaire. Right? I'm willing to bet the vast majority of her constituents aren't billionaires. So the political math of doing something like this adds up. Now, if she had isolated someone based off of their race or their sex or something like that, we would instantly realize, oh my gosh, that's racist, that's sexist.
And the math wouldn't add up.
And the math wouldn't necessarily add up. But when you can do it based off of current economic status, because that's the other thing I like, current economic status, this becomes really easy. And this is illustrated every time someone goes and does like a man on the street interview, woman on the street interview, and says, do you think the rich pay their fair share? Well, again, in somebody's mind, all they know is, well, I'm not rich and I don't like, how much I'm paying taxes. And I'm constantly told by my political leaders that the rich aren't paying their fair share. So of course they're not. Okay, well, what do you think a fair share would be? Well, they should at least pay 20%. And then lo and behold, it's like, okay, well, they're actually paying 40. Like, oh my gosh, really? So this is one of those things where this is a political strategy. The political strategy is the source of your problems is this very, very small group of wealthy elites, and they need to be punished. And if you elect Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she'll take what they have because, after all, they're the ones, hurting the number of people they negatively impact. Now, here's what is so brilliant about this on a simplified level. Everybody can think of some billionaire that they don't like. And then that billionaire becomes the personification of anybody out there that happens to have $1 billion. Not to mention the fact that if you really break down what she wants, it's not just billionaires she's after. She's after far more than that. But
I want to bring up, by the way, a lot of these billionaires' wealth is tied up in non-cash assets.
Yeah. They might own real estate or stocks or they might own a company.
This is something that irritates me all the time is like when the market goes down, they say Elon Musk lost, X billion dollars. Yeah, that's because Tesla stock went down 5%.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that he literally has a wallet with $1 billion bills in it and are just walking around. Like a lot of these billionaires' wealth is tied up in companies that they created.
Yeah.
And they're not going to sell. They might sell some shares every now and then, but they're not going to give up control. Elon Musk is not going to sell every share of Tesla because he wants to run the company.
Well, here's what I think we need to understand about this. So why would she do this? I think AOC might actually believe this.
I do too.
Because ultimately when it comes down to it, she does believe. I know whenever we call someone a Marxist, it's like, I'm not saying that she's a Marxist in the sense that she literally wants to realize Karl Marx's dream for political, but she definitely buys in to Marxist ideology when it comes to the way that the way society should largely be arranged and who the villains are within society.
The class struggle narrative of Marxism she buys into.
And here's the problem. So when you're thinking to yourself, how do I respond to this, right? Like I know on some level that this is ridiculous, but I also don't want to be the person sitting around the coffee table going, oh, I love billionaires, right? Here's the problem. Whenever you see someone making generalized distinctions like this on the level of, if you're a billionaire, therefore you're a bad person, you should be concerned. Because that goes right to what Christian was saying, right? That's a form of otherization. And we've seen other times in history when people do this, and they're not doing it based off of their actions, right? It's one thing to say child molesters are a problem. It's another thing to say murderers are a problem. It's completely different to say because you have $1 billion, you are therefore a bad individual. Like that the only way that you could have gotten that was through, screwing somebody else. And that is the message that they're putting across. And this fits right into that narrative that we were talking about. Here's the problem. Again, I can point to Putin, who is a billionaire, and be like, yeah, that guy is a billionaire because he's essentially a Russian oligarch. He has used the power and coercive power of government in order to acquire his wealth and through ill-gotten gains. But the reason why I don't like him is not because he happens to be a billionaire. The reason why I don't like Putin is because how he got his money and what he does with it. On the other side, there are other people that have made a ton of money in this country. And how did they do it? By providing goods and services to people.
Who voluntarily wanted to buy them.
Who voluntarily bought it for him, right? Like, hey, you created, like Jeff Bezos. I'm not a fan of Jeff Bezos, but I think all of us at one point in our life have probably appreciated Amazon in the last couple of years.
I'm not a fan of Bill Gates.
Yeah.
Or Mark Zuckerberg, but I use Microsoft and Facebook products.
Yeah, and I don't use it because I wanted them to become billionaires. I use it because it improved my life. And so by not making this distinction, she's actually engaging in something that is far more morally nefarious than it looks, because she's putting herself up as, oh, I'm just taking care of the little guys against these mean, evil billionaires. No. First tell me, because guess what? There are people that are poor that have done really bad things, and that's why. There are people that are wealthy that have done really bad things, and that's why. And there are people that are wealthy that have done really good things. There are people that are poor that have done really good things. When you don't make a distinction between how someone actually earned the wealth that they have, and you just say, if your wealth reaches this level, you're a bad guy, you're a villain, you need to watch out for whoever's putting that out there. Because that is someone that is willing to use arbitrary distinctions in order to otherize someone. And the only reason they want to otherize them is because they want to hurt them.
So, Hamilton, I know that you found another tweet that I think encapsulates a huge chunk of the left-wing narrative on what is causing the massive... So like we already explained, by the way, in case you didn't get the memo, inflation is being caused by the Federal Reserve printing $5 trillion in less than 24 months.
Elizabeth Warren thinks different.
Elizabeth Warren seems to think differently.
She said, corporate executives are admitting what Americans already know all too well. They are jacking up prices to expand their profit margins. We must put a stop to this corporate price gouging.
So, Nick, I know that you've got a lot to say here.
Oh
I want to start with the railing on her by saying, brother, or should I say sister, you should know better. You want to talk about maliciousness, right? Versus stupidity. This is maliciousness. This is an act of gaslighting. Because Elizabeth Warren is smart enough to realize that the Federal Reserve printed 40% of the money supply in less than 2 years. I'm sorry. Walmart is not the reason that things are more expensive. We just talked about this before. It's the Federal Reserve's monetary policies are the reason. But you know what? That's not a good scapegoat for her. That's not how you get votes. So you know what people like Elizabeth Warren do? They gaslight the public into believing something that is easier to swallow for political reasons rather than tell them the truth of what is happening. The truth of what is happening is the Federal Reserve made the dollar 40% less valuable than it used to be. And so therefore, corporations who have to, they can't run it. Unfortunately, I hate to break it to socialists, but corporations cannot run at perpetual losses and stay in existence.
Yeah, they're not the government.
As much as they want to. But you know what? That's not a good argument to make. You're not going to get a bunch of retweets if you do that. Yeah. So Elizabeth Warren goes out there and says corporate executives are the problem. It's the evil, greedy business owners and corporations that are jacking up the prices.
But here's the part. Here's the reason why this plays with people, because this is a little bit different, right? This is actually a little bit more strategic. Because when AOC is like, oh, if you have $1 billion, you're an evil person. Like, okay, that's a pretty simplistic narrative that doesn't really go in. When Joe Biden says we got to tax corporations more, right? You're starting to see a trend here. When she says this, here's what's interesting. It is absolutely true that a business, not just corporations, any business, wants to sell their product in order to get as much profit as possible. And there is nothing inherently wrong with that. And you know how I know? Because everyone I know that has ever looked for a job tries to sell their labor at the highest price possible, right? There's a competing interest between someone that is selling you something and you buying it. And those competing interests equal the equilibrium, which is to say, you have something I want, right? I have something you want. I have the money, you have the product or the service. You can't charge whatever you want because I can go to somebody else, right? Or I can find an alternative. You have to charge the most that I'm willing to pay. And the way we know that that's a mutually beneficial transaction is if we both agree to it voluntarily. I'm not forced to do it. You're not forced to do it. What's amazing about this is, yes, people want to sell for a higher profit. Okay, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Profit is actually an indicator that you have done something in an effective and efficient way, provided that somebody is voluntarily doing business with you instead of being forced, like by the government. What's interesting here is when she talks about price gouging. As if there's some universe out there where corporations, without the help of the government, this is an important distinction, can simply go out there and say, well, I want the price to be double. And consumers will just be like, oh, well, gosh, I guess we got to. No, that's not what happens. The whole purpose of competition within the marketplace is that if somebody comes out there and charges way too much for a particular product, somebody else is able to compete and steal their business away. And how do we know that happens? Because it happens all the time in this country. Some of the biggest companies in this country 50 years ago don't exist today because somebody else came in with a better product, a better service at a better price.
Yeah, look at what happened to Sears.
Yeah, and go back to the other tweet here for a second, because there's another thing I gotta hit on here real quick. Again, what is so wrong about this is that the reason why I say this is actually a little bit more clever way to put it is because she can point to balance sheets and say, well, look, they are making higher profits. Until you start to recognize that the way that she's determining higher profit margins fails to take into account two things. One, you may have more dollars on your balance sheet, but if they don't buy the same thing that same amount of dollars did a year ago, you don't have more wealth. You don't actually have more profit.
The irony of that is she's using corporations to blame for inflation, but she's justifying
for price
that.
Increases.
Yeah. Yes. she's justifying that by looking at corporate balance sheets and saying they're at an all-time high, which, by the way, is not true. Not every corporation's at an all-time high in terms of how much money they're making. But she's saying they're making more money than they did last year because the value of the dollar's gone down. So she's not applying her same inflation argument to the balance sheet of the corporations themselves. If a corporation made hypothetically, if a business made $100 one year and then $105 the next year, you could be like, oh my God, they're making more money than they ever did
profits.
before. But if inflation's 10%, the $105 is in raw dollar amounts actually worth less than the $100 they made the year before.
And you know what? You know how people understand this? People are like, oh, wages have gone up 5.5%. Yeah, but inflation's at 8.5%. So you're not better off. But if I wanted to, if I wanted to use Elizabeth Warren's argument, I could come in and say, workers are making more in this country than they've ever made before. But everyone would know that was absurd. Here's the other thing, too, that never gets taken into account. And this is clever, because what they will do is they will be very, very selective on when they look at the profit margins. Because here's another thing that often ends up happening. When you have shortages due to supply chain crises, on top of when you're inflating the currency. So now what you have is more dollars for fewer goods and services. That always causes prices to go up. If you're a business, this is how politicians will like, well, when they were, all the gas they're selling you right now, they bought that when oil was $100 a barrel, but now they're charging you as if it was 105 or 110, right? They're price gouging you. No. What they're doing is what entrepreneurs do, and that is they're predicting what the price is going to be in the future. And so what they sell it to you for now takes into account two things. It's not just what they bought it for and their overhead and everything else. They also have to sell it to you at a price which will allow them to restock based off of what they have to predict the price will be in the future. Well, Liz, I got bad news for you. When the government is throwing more money into the economy and just arbitrarily printing it off, when you're advocating for more taxes, making it more expensive to them run their business, when you're pushing for more green energy policies, when you're pushing for more regulations, fines, and fees, they have to take that into account for everything they're selling today, not just when you happen to implement it. They have to predict it. That's the function the entrepreneur plays in the economy. So when you are deliberately dishonest, by only taking in certain factors into account, you are lying to people, or you're an idiot. And neither one is someone I want in charge of fiscal and monetary policy. All right, let's go to one of my favorite people ever. Bernie Sanders. The United States has the most dysfunctional, inefficient, bureaucratic, and expensive healthcare system in the world. It's time for Medicaid for all. I actually responded to this one on Twitter.
Can we actually lump this into the other tweet too that he sent? Can we talk about both of those at the same time? Because there was another tweet that he said something about gas prices.
Yeah, greed, greed, greed. While Americans are struggling at the pump, in the first 3 months of this year, 21 oil and gas companies made over $41 billion in profits, more than double their profits from last year. The problem is not inflation. The problem is corporate greed. Again, you're starting to see the narrative, right? It's always the same thing. It's not inflation. It's not them. It's not the government. No. It's evil, greedy corporations that apparently now develop some sort of magical power where they can charge whatever they want, and there's no competitive force to actually like.
Here's what's so disingenuous about what he's talking about. Guess what people were doing last year? Stuck at home.
Yeah.
They weren't driving anywhere. They weren't going anywhere.
Oh, and why were they not going anywhere? Partially because of COVID. The other part was because
the government shut down the economy.
They told them you can't.
Behold, when the government shuts down the economy and nobody's commuting to work and nobody's traveling, ExxonMobil isn't going to be making any money. I remember actually at the time when ExxonMobil was struggling to pay its dividend to its shareholders. They came this close to cutting their dividend because they were bleeding money. They were bleeding out on the floor in November 2020, and because the whole country was shut down, nobody was going anywhere. Gas prices were like $1.50 here. They might have been lower in some places in the country. If just corporate greed alone is the reason for healthcare or gas prices to go up, why wasn't Exxon charging $4 a gallon in September 2020 when the economy was shut down?
Well,
because they couldn't get away with it.
Yeah, and his original thing too on the whole healthcare idea is like, it's expensive and bureaucratic. So your solution is more bureaucracy.
What's the Thomas Sowell quote about healthcare in general? About the same people who say that.
Oh yeah,
we
the same people that we can't, the same people that say that we can't afford healthcare as it currently is, thinks that we can add a massive bureaucracy and and then it'll somehow become more affordable. Like if we can't afford it without the massive bureaucracy, how do we afford it with the massive bureaucracy? But that's what he's essentially saying. Again, the reason why I point this one out, because this one's a little bit different. Obviously, this greed one is the same, the healthcare one. It's because they've already decided what all the solutions are. The solutions are more government power. It's them having more control over the economy. And so the bad guys are always anybody they don't control. And then they never take responsibility for what they actually do control. They do have control over the taxes, over the regulations, over the fines, over the fees, over the processes for new drugs getting approved, over the patents that now can be exercised on a drug that was made free in 1922. Right? They do this. And then when it fails or when it injects bureaucracy and expense into the system, do they ever come back and say, you know what, maybe that good thing we were trying to do, maybe the process that we tried to implement it is not producing the favorable results. Maybe we should rethink it. No.
Never.
No. It is always they are the solution. And they don't mind lying to you about it because it is so easy to otherize somebody else as the source of the problem. They're the bad guy, the source of all evil and frustration. And if only Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and AOC had the power that they need to truly go after these people.
The irony is they have the power. They're the ones in DC making policy. What all of this illustrates, and I think we have 2 more tweets to show.
Yeah.
So we can go to the next one because it kind of goes into this. So the irony of this one, and Nick, I'll let you read it off.
So this is Elizabeth Warren. The more student debt President Biden cancels, the more we narrow the racial wealth gap among borrowers and the bigger the boost to America's economic future. This is the right thing to do. Hashtag cancel student debt.
So first off, if we cancel student debt, inflation's going to go up even more. Yeah. That's just a fact because
what will people with student debt have? More buying power.
No. That's not the issue. It's not that they'd have more buying power. I mean, indirectly that would be it. But what would be causing this, and Nick can explain this probably a little bit better than I can, but what would be causing this is the government's going to be the taxpayer. It's not the government. It's the taxpayer. It's us. It's you who's listening. They're going to be footing the bill for it.
Yeah.
That's more government spending.
Yeah.
Government spending, government printing, government spending is what is driving inflation through the roof. We have all-time high government spending and we have all-time high government printing. Those 2 things are the reason that inflation is 8.5%. And by the way, inflation is probably over 8.5% because the government is also the one in charge of measuring the level of inflation.
Well, and here's the important thing to understand, because this is one that actually a lot of people resonate with, because they feel like the government is engaged in predatory lending, which I think is actually true. I think some of what they did was absolutely 100%. Predatory lending. The interest rates seem unreasonable to a lot of people, right? You can't get out of this through bankruptcy law, right? So all of those things, people are going to be like, yeah, this does seem problematic. Here's what you need to understand about this whole movement to cancel student debt. You can't. Nope. I don't mean it would be a bad idea if you did. I mean, it is literally impossible to cancel the debt. All you can do is transfer the debt onto somebody that never took out the loan. And what we found when you actually look at who actually has the vast majority of student loan debt, and you look at the poorest people that have it, it's about 8%. When you look at the wealthiest people who have student loan, it's like 32%. So don't let anybody fool you that this is somehow about justice for poor people. This is about justice for poor people.
You know what this is about? This is about rewarding the Democratic Party's constituency.
Yes.
Because people with college degrees increasingly are voting Democrat more than anybody else.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
What they are doing, the Democrats do this all the time.
Yes.
Where they play these identity politics games in order to try to divide the electorate in half and pick the larger half of the electorate and then pander to that half in order to try to win an election. That's all that they're interested in is simply the raw pursuit of power. And by the way, there's plenty of Republicans that do the same thing.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not saying that there's not, but this is what, when I say good politicians, I don't mean this as a compliment. This is what good politicians do, where they look at the electorate and then they cut a slice through the middle of it, and one slice is always going to be large. You're never going to get it perfectly, right? They cut a slice through the cake of the electorate, and then they look at which the larger cake, and then they try to just pander to that cake. And Elizabeth Warren is pandering to what she increasingly sees as her party base, which are people that have a bunch of college degrees.
Yeah.
And those people make more money than people that don't have college degrees, but they also have more debt usually.
Well, and the interesting thing about this as well is that the reason why this also resonates with people is because they understand the idea that, like, oh, yeah, if you didn't have $100,000 in college debt, you would be able to buy a house or you would be able to buy a car. And the reason why Christian says that would actually contribute to inflation at this point is not because we think college students having more purchasing power is a bad thing. It's a question of how do you get that purchasing power? Well, if the money's been spent, and it has, right? And we just cancel that loan. Again, you can't cancel the transfers. So the only way that person will have, quote, more purchasing power is if you steal purchasing power from somebody else through higher taxes, or you steal everybody's purchasing power by simply printing more money in order to pay off that debt.
Or borrowing it.
That you assumed. And so this is the problem. Once again, it's this whole idea of it might sound superficially plausible to somebody that, yeah, if we just took all these poor students that work so hard to get through college who can't buy a house, if we eliminate this debt, then they'd be able to buy a house. Okay, well, first of all, your housing prices would go up because you'd have people that were now being able to spend money because they had already spent that money. That's the important thing to understand. It's not like that money, they had already spent it. So the only way the government can balance that student loan debt sheet is by increasing taxes on people that didn't take out the loan or by printing more money and devaluing everybody's dollar even more. So this is what is so intellectually dishonest about this.
One of the things that we talked about at the very beginning of this podcast was the everything bubble. We didn't say it was the housing bubble. We didn't say it was the stock market bubble. We said it was the everything bubble. That includes student loans. That includes college. One of the things that gets lost on this is the reason that college has gone, I think the cost of a college degree has gone up something along the lines of like 8 times inflation.
Oh, it's ridiculous.
Since like the 70s or 80s. Like 8 times inflation. I might be off by a magnitude or two, but I guarantee you it's going up faster than inflation. I would bet the farm on that. And part of the reason is because the federal government is subsidizing it.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, Nick, you can make a better argument on this than anybody that I know about what is causing the student loan bubble.
So why are because this is weird because it's like this perpetual motion machine with respect to leftist policy. So they say, oh my gosh, college is really expensive. And they combine that with, and college is necessary in order to get a really good job. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to provide student loans for students that wouldn't necessarily be able to qualify for that. And the population looks and goes, well, yeah, people that go to college tend to make more money. And, if we're helping people that wouldn't otherwise be able to afford to go to college, well, then we'll have more people making more money. And this is going to pay for itself. And that seems superficially plausible until you look at the perverse incentives which are added into the system by the government being the one that takes over the loan process. Because if you're going to get a loan to go to college from a private sector lender, they got a couple questions for you. Question 1, how good did you do in high school? Because they want to know that you actually developed the sort of studying habits and whatnot that you need in order to be successful in college. Step 2, what are you majoring in? Because they want to know that you're majoring in something that's actually going to get you that good paycheck to pay back the loan. Now, take them completely out of the process and put it in the hand of the politicians. Do they have the same incentive before they give you the loan? No, because A, it's not their money. They don't have a fiduciary responsibility to the taxpayer. Secondly, they have every incentive to get as many of you dependent on the college loan debt as possible so they can then run around and say, well, the solution here is to forgive the college loan debt. And what happens on the other side? The universities love this because now they can raise rates.
It's an unlimited source of money for them.
And not only can they raise rates, like the most pernicious part, everybody talks about increased price of college. That's actually not the most pernicious thing what universities are doing right now. Here's the most pernicious thing. They can raise the rates and give you less value for the degree that you actually pay for. Because now, I am not trying to get you to come to my school with these thousands of dollars you automatically have that came from a private sector lender who is interested in the quality, the economic viability of the degree you get. No, government's doing it.
No.
I can offer all kinds of degrees. I can offer all kinds of crazy classes. I can push gender studies degrees and charge you $50,000 a year tuition, if not more. And then you leave with a worthless degree. And not only, this is the crazy part, not only does it not hurt the university, not only does it not hurt the Democrat politician, that they essentially fleece the taxpayers in order to pay tens of thousands of dollars for a worthless degree, it's actually beneficial to the politicians that gave the loan and the universities because they get to go right back to the electorate and say, how horrible is it that this person can't get a job? How bad is the economy? This is capitalism's fault. What we need is to forgive that student loan. University doesn't care. They're getting their money.
No, the university does care. They want it because if you tell a group, an industry, the college university industry, that the federal government will finance at no cost the full ride for people, doesn't, we're going to forgive all the debt, right? If you signal that message that price is no object because the Federal Reserve is going to cover the tab, colleges are going to, I said college tuition's going up multiple times what inflation is. If you think college is expensive right now, wait until you see how much it's going to cost when it's free.
Yeah. Well, and again, the worst part about this is not only have they racked up student debt and racked up the price of tuition, they actually have more and more worthless degrees that they're offering as a result of enticing people into this environment with the false belief that a degree equals a good paycheck. No. Quality skills respected in the marketplace. Yep. Now, I've seen people come up before. I'm like, it's not all about money, Nick. Well, it sure as hell is when you want someone else to pay off your loan, isn't it, Sparky? Right? No. Yes, when you go to college, if you want to major in 16th century French poetry, I think you should be able to do that. I do not think you should be able to demand that somebody else pays for that degree. And that's the problem that we're in right now. And again, it's just so frustrating because it's a combination. Christian said it best. This is a process whereby certain politicians get to reward their base for voting the way they want them to. Mm-hmm. And they get to reward them by using everybody else's money in the process. And then making you feel like you're a bad person if you don't want to pay off somebody else's debt.
In the words of Bastiat, it's legalized plunder.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Is this our last one? Yeah, we got one more debt when you go. And this is funny too. President Biden visited a family farm today in Kankakee. If you're from Illinois, I apologize if we butchered that. Kankakee, Illinois, where he announced new actions to address Putin's price hike, make food more affordable, and lower costs for farmers.
So you know what I find so funny about this narrative?
Yeah.
I'm old enough to remember there is no inflation. Mm-hmm. That's the narrative that was being made in February 2021 when I wrote that Facebook post predicting what was going to be happening. There is no inflation. And then it was inflation is transitory. I remember Jerome Powell going before Congress multiple times telling people inflation is transitory. It's going to go through, as soon as the economy reopens, we're going to be fine. And then it was, inflation's not that big. It's not that bad of a deal. It's not that high. It's not as high as you think it is. And then it was, inflation was actually Trump's fault.
Yeah.
I remember that one. In fact, that's one you're still seeing. But now Trump's been replaced with the boogeyman of Vladimir Putin, who, by the way, is a terrible person.
Yeah.
I'm not defending anything about Putin. The invasion of Ukraine. There's no doubt that Russia invading a country in Europe is contributing to some of the problems we're having. But it is minuscule compared to it. The act of Russia invading Ukraine, let's say hypothetically, is 1% of the reason for the problem that we're in. And yet, it is 90% of the explanation that you're seeing from people in the White House for why we're in the disaster that we're currently in. And the reason for it is because of politics. Mm-hmm. As you said at the beginning of this podcast, they know that the general public knows there's something wrong. That when you go to the grocery store, that it's more expensive than it used to be. That, the price of gas is higher than it ever has been at any point in the entire country's history. They know that they can't lie to people or gaslight them into believing that there's not a problem because John Q. Public knows that there's a problem. So the response now is, as you said, shifting the blame. And it's just amazing that whatever is in the news cycle, that's now the boogeyman for the reason that we're in this problem right now. It's never the Federal Reserve's fault, and let alone Congress's fault.
And I guarantee you, as he's talking about Putin's price hike, which again, first of all, total blame shifting. Again, can the invasion of Ukraine account for some increases in marketplace price? Sure. But it's a fraction compared to everything else that is going on with respect to policy. Second of all, make food more affordable and lower costs for farmers. I guarantee you what he means is more subsidies. Because that is always the Democrat solution is never we're going to reduce the regulations, we're going to reduce your taxes. It's never we're going to make it easier for you to produce, right? Because their environmental policy won't allow for more large scale production. The regulations that they have through the FDA won't allow for smaller farmers to be able to sell their produce to smaller markets and point-to-point sales.
And as soon as those smaller farmers become big farmers, then they're the problem.
So it's this whole idea of like this is garbage. Like he was pushing for ethanol again to help with overall gas price, which by the way, the long-term benefits of ethanol are crap because it destroys your engine. And then guess what happens when you subsidize farmers to put their corn into ethanol production as opposed to food production? Food prices go up because it's not just corn. I actually saw somebody, well, who cares if corn's a little bit more expensive? Like, moron. Do you understand that the sort of things that are used for ethanol don't just affect the price of corn?
You know who cares?
It affects pretty much every, go ahead.
You know who cares if corn is more expensive?
Corn producers?
19th century Britain.
Yeah. Yeah, we have a whole line of that. But this is again, the problem is they never look back to, okay, how are government policies negatively impacting the ability for farmers to produce more? That's not the question. It's just, we're just going to give more money to farmers and that'll make it better. Or what they did in the 1930s. This was crazy. So at a time when Americans were legitimately starving, I'm not talking about now where we say that, oh, well, people have food insecurity because, no, a significant amount of Americans were actually hungry and not getting it, were malnutrition as a result of the Great Depression. The federal government at that same time was subsidizing farmers not to grow things
or to destroy crops.
And then they would buy surplus crops. The federal government would buy surplus livestock and crops, and then they would go and they would give them to hungry people. Oh, wait, no, that's not what they did. They destroyed it. So these are the same people that want to blame Putin or want to blame greedy corporations for what it is that they're doing, the perverse incentives they've created. And it is, I cannot emphasize enough, we cannot stop everything that is about to happen. You just can't.
Oh, it's too late now.
The seeds for this have been sown in some cases over a century ago, in other cases for decades, and in some cases in the last 4 years, right?
Or in the last 24 months.
Or in the last 24 months. And the bottom line is we're not going to be able to avoid it. There's going to be pain. The real question is will we properly diagnose why we're having this pain? And will we actually be able to address the underlying issues as opposed to just taking this placebo that might make us feel better about some of the symptoms while at the same time actually making us more sick than we already are?
I think that's a great way to start the conclusion of the making the argument segment for us, Nick.
Go ahead, Nick. Help us make the argument on this.
Okay, so here's what's most important. We went through all these different things that you're seeing from the left when it comes to higher prices, when it comes to food shortages, supply chain crises, rising tuition costs, all of these things. And the same politicians are saying the same thing that they always have, that what's lacking is that they don't have enough power to either confiscate money from other people and give it to you, or they don't have the power to properly regulate and control the marketplace. And what they're failing to actually identify is a couple of things. One, it's proper diagnosis of the problem. Inflation is not something that is arbitrarily caused by a couple of businesses rising prices. Businesses more often than not rise prices as a result of two things: supply and demand issues, and ultimately, in this case with inflation, whether or not the overall value of your dollar has been decreased as a result of the government just arbitrarily printing more paper dollars. Right? So you have to properly diagnose inflation for what it is and how it has this negative impact on prices across everything. The other thing that we need to understand is that whenever we talk about things, whether it's student debt, whether it's the increasing cost of healthcare, before you let any politician tell you that the reason why this is happening is greed, I just want you to remind them of two things. One, being greedy doesn't actually do anything unless there's an action involved. And two, politicians are every bit as greedy as anybody else. In fact, I would argue more so in many cases because they have the power to use force to get what they want, as opposed to private sector businesses, which have to actually convince you to do business with them. So the perverse incentive that is already created within government to be able to use power to get what they want is something that we need to associate with some of these greed problems that we have. And then finally, here's what we need to recognize. Most of the problems with rising prices, whether it's prescription drugs, whether it's healthcare, whether it's college tuition, whether it's supply chain crises, you can point directly back to some sort of government intervention that was made into the economy in the form of higher taxes, more regulations, more fees, more fines, and more barrier to entry. It's really simple. Prices are connected to supply and demand. If there is more demand, you have to have more supply in order to create that equilibrium. The government is the primary force in the world right now that is artificially restricting supply, causing prices to go up, and then telling you that all you need to do is give them more power and they'll make it go away. Ladies and gentlemen, they can't. And they need to be blamed for what's going on. I don't mean a particular political party. I mean a perverse economic philosophy, and I don't care which politician spews it. If it's bad economic policy, it doesn't work, and it will yield bad results, create perverse incentives, and hurt people. What is needed more than ever, and we have seen this before, all the way back to the early 1920s, what we need more now than ever is for the government to get its monetary policy in order. We need to start returning back towards sound money to where the government cannot just automatically inflate the currency whenever it wants to try to pay some bills at your expense. Inflation is a hidden tax. Always remember that. Secondly, we need less government spending, because every time the government is spending money, it had to get it from somewhere, and it's either inflating the currency, it's borrowing it against future generations, or it's taking it from you directly in taxes. So for every dollar the government hands you and says, look what we did, just remember, they took that dollar out of the private sector in the first place, robbing you of a potential opportunity, of a potential purchase, robbing you of what you would have done with your money, and giving special favor to not only politicians, but those that have the best lobbyists. So we need sound fiscal policy. We need less government spending, and we need more freedom within the marketplace. Everything the government can possibly do right now to make it easier for you to work, to invest, to get a job, to start a company, that's what it should be focused on. Instead, they're doing the exact opposite. They are robbing you of the very opportunities that you need at the time when you need them the most, and then they're giving you a handout in the form of a government check, in the form of a government program, and hoping that it will distract you from the fact that they're the ones that created this problem in the first place. So as usual, what is needed is more freedom within the marketplace, more freedom within how you live your life and spend your money, not more government control.
Nick, there's definitely some resources that we could tell our people about.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of basic resources that are really important here. And once again, this is going to come as no surprise when I list Thomas Sowell as one of the people that you should look at, looking at economics. But I'm going to give you some specifics books. The guy has written dozens of books. I'm going to give you some very specific ones. You either need to read these books, or if you don't have time, which I completely understand, go on Uncommon Knowledge, or a couple other places where they actually go through and they explain certain principles, and they talk to Thomas Sowell, and he does a great job. He's very easy to listen to. We're talking about like 30 to 40 minute things, right? You can do this. It's easy to listen to in the car, easy to watch at home on YouTube.
It's not even work. It's actually fun.
It is fun. So, but here's the book: Basic Economics, Discriminations and Disparities, Wealth, Poverty, and Politics. These are 3 books that I would highly recommend. If you got time to read these ones. Or, again, go and look for Thomas Sowell's interviews where he's talking about these things, because he does such a great job of refuting so much of the false narratives that we've heard. Another one that is a classic, right, is Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. Very short read, but there's certain principles that he talks about in there with respect to perverse and positive incentives that once you read them, you will sit there and think, like, why didn't I think of it this way before? It's just, it really is this eye-opening experience when you read Economics in One Lesson. And the third resource I'm going to give you, and this is a fun one. We're talking, I think it's 5 minutes or whatnot, but there's these two economists that did these videos. One is called Fight of the Century, and it's basically like a mock debate between Friedrich Hayek.
A rap battle.
A rap battle between Friedrich Hayek and I didn't want to say that. I didn't want to lose him right off the bat. Friedrich Hayek and John Maynard Keynes, right? Because the two most influential economists probably within the 20th century with respect to kind of the core belief within free markets or centrally planned economies is John Maynard Keynes for centrally planned economies, more, government spending and things like that, versus more free market economics, the Austrian school, to some degree the Chicago school under Milton Friedman, but it's Hayek. And I know what you're thinking. You're like, this has got to be the cheesiest, dumbest thing It actually is. It was incredibly well produced. But they've got one called Fight of the Century, and they've got one called Fare the Boom and Bust. And they do an excellent job of explaining some of these problems in a way. Like, it got to the point where my kids could explain the Austrian theory of the business cycle because they had memorized this rap battle.
So my prediction that I made in February, I wrote that after rewatching the Fear the Boom and Bust video.
It's entertaining. It's
we'll link
funny.
it in the description.
It's entertaining. It's funny. Look, again, I know what you're thinking. You're like, this is stupid.
No, it's worth it.
Just trust me. Just try. If you've ever trusted me on anything, trust me on these. Fight of the century and for the boom and the bust. Great things. Yeah. So those are some resources. Christian, do you have any resources that you want to?
I mean, the Y Minutes, are actually a really good resource.
I should be plugging for stuff that we actually do here, right?
So for those of you listening at home or watching, we do more than just this podcast.
Yeah.
Hamilton produces more than just making the argument. He's also the producer of the Y Minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And all three of us actually play a role in that process.
Yeah.
And the Y Minutes are really short videos. They're usually about 3 minutes long in length. And they discuss all sorts of, different topics throughout history, economics, philosophy, government, the sort of stuff that we talk about here, but in a little bit, less complex, more visually pleasing.
Yeah.
Lots of graphics.
Yeah,
we
lots
just
of
had
graphics.
a great episode on Singapore.
Yeah,
and
did pretty well.
that's a great
I was
example of how
actually-
a free market economy can, raise a nation out of poverty and help us succeed.
A better one that I think is worth watching, if you've just finished this episode, if you've gotten this far into this podcast and you're still interested in us, I highly recommend that you watch our video about the Japanese price asset bubble in the 1980s.
What's the title of that video?
It's called Why Japan Never Became a Superpower. So if you're older than us, if you're older than Hamilton and I, if you're like in your 30s or 40s, you probably remember as a kid, everybody was talking about how Japan was like the emerging world power, and they never quite made it. They never became the economic superpower that everybody thought they were in the 80s. And the reason why is because Japan, now it's different than what we have here. There's definitely some differences. Japan's demographics were way different, but there were a lot of similarities between the implosion of the Japanese price asset bubble and what is currently going on here in the United States. I don't think it's an exact one for one, but there's a lot of eerie similarities between the two.
I'm going to give you one spoiler on this too, just to encourage you to go and see it. If you want an idea of how bad the real estate bubble in Tokyo got, we talk about real estate bubbles in the United States. You want to talk about how bad it got in Tokyo? This
is in the 80s.
This is in the 80s. There was a palace complex, right? The old palace complex in Tokyo. And that palace complex, that one area of Tokyo, was estimated to be worth an entire American state. And I'm not going to tell you which one, but it was the equivalent of all of the real estate in an entire American state. And the one it was will shock you. Because right now you're thinking Wyoming. It wasn't.
Oh,
I am telling you right now, go watch that video. It's Why Japan Never Became a Superpower. It's on the Y Minutes.
We'll link it.
Yeah.
I'll one up them just to hype this episode even more. There was one ward in downtown Tokyo. So, few square blocks, right? Yeah. There was one ward in downtown Tokyo that was worth more than all of the real estate in one entire country in the world.
And right now you're thinking Haiti, and it's not.
And it's not Haiti.
I'll give you a hint. They're considered something of an economic.
But if you walk away from this episode, though, because we're kind of in the speakeasy section.
Yeah.
We're wrapping this up. But if you walk away from this episode and you walk away with anything, I think Nick hit the nail on the head in his making the argument segment about how, at the end of the day, the reason that we're in the everything bubble when it comes to the markets, which are starting to unravel, real estate, which is not yet unraveled, student loans, which is through the roof. The reason that we are at this point is because, as usual, the political class are acting like arsonists who are now pretending to be the fire brigade. Yeah. They are coming out there and they're telling the general public, we've got the solutions. We need to tax the evil, greedy rich people. We need to take more money from them. We need to increase taxes. We need to increase regulations. We need to forgive all the debt. When they are the ones who are responsible for the bubble in the first place, either directly or indirectly through their actions, either through direct government spending or through indirectly allowing the Federal Reserve to get away with what they've been doing for so long. And I think that is the heart of why we are in this economic crisis. That's why inflation is through the roof. That's why you can't afford a home if you're under the age of 30. It's why student loan debt is becoming one of the largest forms of debt in the entire country. It's because government policies have made it so. And the same people that are responsible for that are the same people that are now offering themselves as the solution to a problem that they created.
It's a great summarization.
That was beautiful. That was beautiful. And if anybody thinks that we're just we're oversimplifying this on our side and saying, it's all government. Again, I want to emphasize something. We're not sitting here just blaming Democrats. I'll be happy to point the finger at Republicans too, because they also bear some of the responsibility. What we want people to understand at the end of the day is that this is about good, sound economic policy, fiscal policy, investment policy, spending policy, monetary policy. And I don't care what party you belong to. If you're violating certain rules of reality, you're going to get bad results. And if you're operating within certain rules of reality, you're going to get positive results. And it doesn't mean that people are always going to make wise decisions with respect to their own investments or what business they decide to start. But the vast difference between the experiment within the United States and the rest of the world is that you have the power over making these economic decisions for yourself and improving your station and making your own life better through risk and reward and work-life balance. Like you have freedom and ability to do that. And all of the people right now telling you that they're going to save you are offering to save you at the expense of the freedom that is absolutely necessary to be able to make those decisions. And so I think some people act like, well, maybe I'm giving up a little bit of freedom, but it's going to take away some of this anxiety. Oh my God, please look at history on this. It doesn't. I know they're promising you this. It doesn't produce it. You end up with, you end up with less anxiety because you know you're never going to be able to go anywhere in this life when they're the ones controlling it for you. I don't think that's the sort of environment any of us want to live in.
And I would argue that long term, you actually have more anxiety.
Oh yeah, well,
centrally systems don't work.
I was being flippant on the, you get more anxiety because then it's no longer a question of will I ever get that house I wanted. It's a question of am I going to be taken away and put in a mine somewhere?
Where am I going to get my food next?
Yeah, there was a funny meme I saw where it was, hey comrade, I'm supposed to be doing the poetry for the revolution. It's like, oh yes, you can think of poetry while digging for raw earth materials with rare earth materials with no safety equipment.
We need to tweet this meme at some point. There was this meme that said the differences between capitalism and communism, and it was like the difficulty of capitalism was like you get a little plastic duck.
Yeah.
I'll show you.
I saw it.
And then the other one was like the body count.
Yeah.
It's fun stuff.
Well, look, I appreciate everyone hanging out. I know we kind of went through a lot of things on this episode, but the reason why we did is because, again, we are trying to prepare you to be able to defend against some of the most common arguments that are made out now. And the reason why this is so important is because, like I already said, the car crash is going to happen. Right, but the same people that are crashing the car are right now preparing the work within your kids' schools, within the universities, within the news, within popular culture. They are prepping the objective so that when it crashes, you are blaming everybody except the people that actually made it happen. And we want you to know the truth so that you can fight against it. One of these episodes too, I think we'll go into a little bit more on what you can actually, what you can do on a personal level. Because a lot of people are like, okay, great, Nick, what you're telling me is vote better, but what do I do right now when I can't afford a house or something else? Actually, there are some answers to that as well that we can talk about. We don't give financial advice. We don't give investing advice. I want to make that very clear. But, again, interesting opportunities are going to be created as a result of this to where I think more and more people are going to take power, where the government might come in and say, well, you can't do that. You can't do that. And I think people are going to be like, all right, we'll see. So anyways, thank you very much for joining us on this episode of Making the Argument. Next episode, we've got our first guest coming on where we're going to analyze political speech. And I'm not just talking about Reagan and Thatcher. We're gonna have some people that are gonna be analyzed by the expert that we're bringing on that you are not gonna want to miss. Maybe you should analyze one of my speeches. That would be dangerous.
We shouldn't tell him about it.
We should tell him like, hey, we've got one more speech we want you to analyze, and they'd be like, this guy's a moron.
That episode comes out this Thursday.
All right. So once again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next episode.